Rowena, does that put a lot more pressure back in your direction, in I guess the fragmentation of the landscape? Do you think clients will trust somebody else to orchestrate all of these various channels that they might work in, or are you going to have to staff up further and further at the client end?
I think it will depend on your business, but I do think that clients are looking for their agencies to help them make sense of the total. And how are those individual parts working to make sense of that total? At the end of the day, every managing director will say to any marketing team, what's driving my share, what's driving my sales? It's being able to answer that question in a meaningfully simple way, because often it's the 2-second elevator speech that you get that really makes a difference in terms of how you can move forward. And whether you have the trust to continue to innovate because your business is in a good place and people believe that you can move forward. I do think that the media agencies have a really interesting role now in that you can negotiate added value in many different formats. So if I go back 10 years, it was kind of like, or maybe TV, more tarps, maybe a 1/3 column in print, and it was pretty standard, maybe some product placement. But now you can negotiate almost anything. And that could go from research to, celebrities, people, content, anything. Holidays, it can be pretty much anything. The challenge is knowing what you want. So I think that's where media agencies, because they manage the bucket, the whole bucket generally, that really places them in a, kind of like a leadership role to be able to identify the challenge and then say, here's how we can negotiate what's of greater value for you.
I think one thing we're trying to do with that as well is we want to take this idea of being able to negotiate. We want to bring that to our creative and digital and all our partners, because it's always been, historically, it's the media agency and the client talking to the network or the owner, and they sort of negotiate stuff works between them. But I think what we're sort of trying to do is bring the creative partners into that, bring the social and digital partners, say, guys, what can we do for you to help what you're doing better? Because it's pointless us negotiating more tarps and better lunches for me. I mean, I like lunches, but it's probably more useful for the client if that's sort of helping other partners do what they do, because networks and publishers have a lot of resources which they could apply to help everyone else in the picture as well. So I think we need to change what the focus of those negotiations are as well.
Can I throw it open to the floor at this point? Is there anyone that would like to ask a question of our 4 panellists?
Hi, I'm Sam McKissick from DT. Rowena, I guess this is a question more for you. One thing we haven't talked about so far, which I think you'd probably have a really interesting perspective of, is the role of a kind of a global marketing and advertising world, and increasingly the role of Asia specifically. And I guess I'm just curious about how you think that relationship between agency and client operates differently in Asian markets, and if there's anything that we could be learning from them here.
I mean, context first, in terms of Asia, I think Asia is more and more being seen as the future because of all the growth coming from emerging markets. And, so many big companies are taking spend, which they used to keep, X% in Europe, X% in the US, X% in Asia. They're taking that and pouring it into Asia. And that's happening very consistently, which is why inflation is so high. In terms of what that means for agency relationships, it's interesting, I was reading this really interesting paper from eConsultancy, which talked about the value of agency relationships for Asia Pacific, and they had a really interesting point of view, which is Asia is not homogenous. You have to break it down into the 3 types of markets, which are kind of the innovative lead markets like Korea and Japan. Then you've got the high growth markets, which are the emerging markets in Southeast Asia. And then you've got the mature markets, which is like Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, Singapore, with the high smartphone penetration. And I think when you start to look at it like that, and then think about, okay, what do those markets need? And it does look different if you look at those 3 different groups. I think the challenge for big multinationals who like to do things under big umbrellas is, how do you make sense of that at a local level, particularly in big markets like China, where a lot of the expertise actually lies in the local agencies. What you tend to see, and this is a generalisation, is that in creative agency relationships and media agency relationships, you can get the greatest impact across the greatest number of markets through, global banners. Not always, but generally. Digital and looking at some of these other skill sets that may have not traditionally been in an agency, that's really where you find the challenge and the diversity of opportunity. And again, I don't consistently see digital agencies having the same capability consistently across, a great spread of markets. And I think multinationals have tried that. They've tried to go, okay, we're going with this brand or this banner, and it hasn't worked out because, again, the talent challenge at a local level.
Hi, I'm Nicole from AdShell, but I have been agency side, so I've seen both sides. I'm just curious. I was curious when I was agency side about head hours and why we charged at head hours, because when I was an agency creative, I wasn't paid for my hours. So it's a really curious thing that I've thought about for a lot of years, and now that I'm client side, it frustrates me a little bit more because, as you might understand. But what do you think is the reason why head hours hasn't been taken over by a product price, as Damien sort of hinted at earlier?
Aaron answered that earlier in that we're still in the 1960s mindset and haven't moved on. I know when I started TCO, we used to have a production-based model and we used to make a lot more money then, and it was a lot easier, way easier, because it was just 30% or whatever it was on line items. Whereas now we'd use all the, FTE, and like my financial controller comes and I just blank over.
I think it's quite hard to make that shift. You need to sit down with the client and actually, I think, look at the entire scope of things you might do with that client and then try and assign different value matrix to them. I mean, trying to work on a performance model, for example, sounds very interesting. Okay, great, we'll do some work. If it goes in market, if it makes return for you, we'll get a share of that. Fantastic. But when you get down to it, it's like, well, if I'm going to make something, I want to control, how you're using media to drive to it, how it's delivered, how it looks like, because all those things are going to affect my return. So all of a sudden, you turn into the client, in about 10 seconds flat once you start to really think that model through. And that works for some instances, like when you have, if it's a digital sales channel, that's a lot easier because you can control a lot of factors, you control people get to it. But if it's a product you buy in a shop, there's distribution, which you'll have no control over. There's lots of factors to play into that. So I think it's head hours, time and material, that's the easiest thing that, don't think about it, it kind of works. But if you really want to move it forward, I think you do have to invest the time in sitting down with your client and agency and trying to understand, look, what can we really drive value for both parties out of looking at differently.
I'm Nicola Patterson from Propeller PR. I had a question about going back to the agency of now, and we've spoken about different components that could possibly make that up, and overlaying this question with the current economic situation that a lot of agencies are facing and feeling pressure under, and clients. I wanted to know what role you see for an agency that isn't necessarily the easy answer, that isn't necessarily the one that will hand you what you need straight away. What role is there for an agency, or what part of the agency of now is an agency that comes back and challenges you and pushes you out of your comfort zone in these times when sometimes all you need is the quick fix?
Every agency should challenge you. If your agency doesn't challenge you, it's a pseudo-marketing department. It's people getting KPI'd. Sorry, but it is. It's people getting KPI'd on ticking boxes, which for some people is perfectly fine. But the agency of now, given the crazy environment, given the crazy economic pressures, the crazy competition, is someone who seriously pushes you out of your comfort zone, and not just in terms of throws you off a cliff, but actually makes you feel comfortable enough to take that risk with them. If your agency doesn't help you in that process, then yeah, just hire some more marketers.
Rowena, do you want to be challenged?
I do. I think everyone will say they do, but people often have a different openness to what that looks like. The one thing I would add to what Damien said is it's good to challenge, but you have to have that very strong relationship of trust, whereby, you know, both sides believe that this challenge is because you really care about the business or what you're trying to achieve. And sometimes the challenge is X and you, like, I still need the quick fix. But then that still gives that openness to, again, listening and maybe, okay, maybe that takes us in a better direction in 6 months' time. So I do think challenge is important, but if it's based on, you know, a relationship that's been proven value in the past.